Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the second weekend of April 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news, focusing on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories and add insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Today, we'll look at the ongoing conversation around President Trump's tariffs. We'll hear about the federal budget and a policy change that is sparking debate. And we'll discuss Border Czar Tom Homan's address to Arizona lawmakers and the responses. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the ongoing conversation around tariffs, it's our Dan McCaleb.
President Donald Trump paused most of his tariffs on imported goods this week, keeping in place a lower 10% reciprocal tariff on products from the European Union and other nations, but he doubled down on his trade war with China, increasing tariffs on Chinese goods from 104% to 125%. China responded by placing a 125% tariff on all products imported from the U.S. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, the Trump administration said dozens of nations called to negotiate after he enacted the higher tariffs last week, and that's why he decided on the 90-day pause. Let's start there, and we'll get into China in a bit.
Sure. So, Trump rolled out this broad array of tariffs, kind of unprecedented in modern politics. Of course, it does have some historical precedent. The market's tanked. There is a lot of fear around this, a lot of questioning of how much, how important markets going up and down really should be to policy making, which is an interesting discussion. But nevertheless, they did tank, and they're scaring a lot of people, I think. And Trump said that he trusted his instincts. He felt that people were getting scared. He's an instinct player. That's what he did. And there's a lot of people happy that he paused the tariffs. I saw some in the Trump administration nodding knowingly in their comments and saying something like, you must not have read The Art of the Deal. This is just part of sort of an elaborate negotiation tactic. Play hardball, put these tariffs on everyone, and then they all come begging for a better deal. And now the stage is set for Trump to negotiate it. So, Dan, on this podcast, you and I talked a couple of months ago about tariffs and whether they were just negotiating tools or policy tools. And you were really talking about the benefit of them as negotiating tactics. And I think we're going to see that here, even though this seemed like we were past the negotiation phase and into the policy phase. Trump suddenly reversed it. And now we're back to the negotiating table. And I guess he's going to try to negotiate dozens of individual trade deals that are better for the U.S. Of course, it remains to be seen just how good those deals are, who are the winners and losers. But Trump is generally right that many other countries have been putting tariffs on us. We've been very generous to them, not doing it. Now, the reasoning for that and how we may benefit by not doing tariffs is definitely something we can discuss as well. But it's true that the world generally, and most of all China, has been taking advantage of us.
After Trump announced that he would put a pause on most of the tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs on Wednesday, markets soared. They declined a little bit Thursday because of the uncertainty of the whole thing. But over the 2 days, they did regain much of the losses since last week when Trump first announced the much higher tariffs. Casey, are American investors going to have to get used to these fluctuations in the stock market during this ongoing uncertainty about the tariffs?
As long as there's this back and forth with China going, I think you're going to see more of this. I'm a little bit skeptical of I think that investors are not, really who should be driving policy. And they do create political pressure for the president when the markets go down. But investors are very short-sighted. They're short-term thinkers. They might be upset about something today just because they're planning to sell tomorrow. So you can't use them for, they're not going to factor in the long-term benefit of, bringing manufacturing back to the Midwest. I mean, they might bake it in a little bit, but it's not going to be nearly as weighed as heavily as just general uncertainty, causing pessimism. Well, I'll just say, I think we have to take the market stuff with a grain of salt.
Well, let's talk about China now. 125% reciprocal tariffs. This is an all-out trade war with essentially America's top rival.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like we are finally at this trade war that has been speculated about. I mean, by the time this podcast airs, Dan, or we finish recording it even, there could be a new ratcheting up of tariffs between China and the U.S. I think there's a lot more support broadly for just taking on China than taking on the world. There's a lot of deals, a lot of our allies we were putting tariffs on in the first round of tariffs. And there was really a question about why are we tariffing so many people we work closely with? Are we going to hurt our international relationships? So Trump is dodging a lot of those criticisms, but focusing on China, he has a lot more political backing, a lot more ammunition. For instance, China basically uses the equivalent of slave labor when it comes to wages and treatment of workers for the things that are produced and we consume in the U.S. And that's one, there's some ethical and moral questions and problems with that, but there's no way an American worker in an American factory can compete with slave labor that doesn't have benefits, doesn't get Christmas week off. I mean, those kinds of things that we kind of come to see as practically human rights here in the U.S. And so there's the competition question. Workers in the U.S. just can't compete with China without tariffs. There's the moral question of how China treats its workers. Not to mention, Dan, this isn't talked about it very much, but China's a communist country. There's totalitarian control. It spies on and monitors its people constantly. It has a social credit system. And there's a lot of pretty evil things about China, this country we're so reliant on and we prop up with our economy. So I think there's a lot of moral, questions that Trump can tap into. But there's definitely going to be economic, impacts from this. I think you will probably see some increase in costs here in the U.S. Although, Dan, I don't know. I mean, we had 20% tariffs on China already. And I haven't heard a lot of outcry of increased inflation. In fact, we saw inflation decreased over the last month, despite the China tariff. So maybe the prices won't raise as much as some of the doomsayers have led us to believe.
China, of course, too, is engaged in intellectual property theft, stealing technology from the United States, claiming it's their own. Of course, in the weapons race, China has a large military, probably second to none, second only to the U.S. So if this escalates any further, who knows? Casey, last word.
Yeah, I mean, keep your eyes on Taiwan now as the more and more pressure for China. I think they can become a little more unstable or more irrational, more prone to take a rash action, do something in Taiwan. Or maybe it'll be a little bit just quieter, remain at a trade war level, and we're going to see a lot of back and forth and see if Trump really is the master of the art of the deal.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the federal budget, we'll go back to Dan McCaleb.
The U.S. House this week passed a $5.8 trillion concurrent budget resolution that would extend President Donald Trump's 2017 tax cuts, but add trillions of dollars in U.S. debt if significant expense cuts are not realized in the future. Budget hawks say the resolution is a gimmick because it zeroes out the cost of the tax cut extension. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, this whole concurrent budget resolution process is a complex one. What do our listeners need to know?
Well, sure. They need to know that, after, weeks and weeks of wrangling, that Republicans were able to unify around getting an actual budget passed. This is not just a short-term fix. This is more substantive. They also need to know that the Senate, kind of incredibly, successfully changed the way that accounting is done on their bills, to make this one appear much cheaper. And it's very controversial. Basically, when they're trying to make the Trump tax cuts permanent. So of course, in 2017, his first term, Trump passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It did things like double the child tax credit, which is very popular, and among many other tax provisions that we enjoy today. But those are going to expire at the end of this year. And so Republicans are kind of under the gun wanting to extend these. Initially, the House said, let's extend it 10 years. And then the Senate said, let's make it permanent. And under this legislation, you would think that, okay, extending the tax cuts, you would have to factor in the cost of that and say, okay, it's going to cost this many trillion each year and add that up. But the Senate said, no, it's existing policy. We don't have to factor that into our accounting. So basically, they don't include the cost of the tax cuts in their version of the bill, which allowed them to kind of, a lot of people called it a gimmick, but they did it, right? And that's where it is. So, some of the estimates say it's going to be like $5.8 trillion over the next 10 years. Now, I will say Republicans really don't like those estimates when you talk to them. They feel that the estimates from the CBO and other groups are not fair because they don't take into account the increased economic growth and increased revenue that tax cuts create. So, theoretically, a lot lower taxes across the board will lead to more economic growth, and we have seen evidence for that. And then more economic growth means more tax revenue when the taxes are collected. So in a way, tax cuts can kind of help pay for themselves. But when you do the budgeting at CBO and things, they don't really take that into account well enough, according to a lot of Republicans. So that's just a side note. So they're basically, these tax cuts are going to be made permanent. It looks like that now the House and the Senate have to come together and work out the details. They need to find a lot of cuts. In the earlier stages of this process, they said, okay, we're going to cut, this many billion from here, but they didn't say specifically where it's going to come from. They just said the committee will figure it out later, which allowed them to kind of get this across the finish line more quickly. But now we're at later, which is the point in the process where they have to say, okay, we're going to cut X dollars from X program. They're going to have to work that out with leadership and others, come up with, as President Trump has called it, one big beautiful bill to make his tax cuts permanent and do some government spending cuts to help pay for it.
The vote Thursday in the U.S. House, Casey, was razor thin, passed just 216 to 214, with all Democrats and 2 Republicans, Representatives Thomas Massey, Republican from Kentucky, and Victoria Sparks, Republican from Indiana, voting with Democrats against the budget. So there's not a whole lot of room for error, particularly when we get into the next part of the process and trying to identify those cuts, because Democrats are not going to support many cuts, I wouldn't think.
No, but I think it's pretty safe to say they're going to have the votes at this point. If people are going to throw a fit, I think they would have stopped it by now, and Johnson would have had to pivot. But, he did make a lot of promises to get the bill this far. So maybe he does have to fulfill some of those promises, but he can kind of now do that, on an ad hoc basis as it's needed behind closed doors to get the votes that he needs. And part of what's, making Republicans feel more comfortable about this is there's going to be a lot of provisions on the border and energy that Republicans have been waiting for. And so, we're going to see better border enforcement. We're going to see, a more favorable, energy environment for domestic energy production. And so those things are, I think, helping, satisfy some concerned Republicans. And basically Republicans were also they were just promised more cuts in the future, I believe. And so we're going to see if Johnson's able to deliver those cuts. Now, Democrats on the other side, they're talking about how this is going to blow out the debt. These tax cuts, disproportionately favor the wealthy. These are some of the things they're saying. But they're also saying, hey, there's no way Republicans are going to do all this without cutting Medicaid and maybe Medicare. And so that's something to be on the lookout for if Democrats, prediction there or warning comes to fruition, if it really comes down to it and Republicans do have to make cuts to Medicaid. Now, Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, has said that the only cuts to Medicaid that are coming are the kind of the waste, fraud, and abuse, which is really popular target right now in the Doge era. With that being said, who gets to define what waste, fraud, and abuse is really probably the question right now, because the devil's on the details. You can say anything is, if you can label something as waste, then you can cut it in this environment.
The 2017 tax cuts were set to expire at the end of this year. This is not a done process. There's still plenty of work left to be done and more votes to come. But if the tax cuts were to expire, the average taxpayer would see a 22% tax hike. Democrats say it mostly goes, the tax breaks tax cuts mostly are for the wealthy, but that's not really true. It would impact the average American middle class worker. Final word, Casey.
Yeah, I mean the tax cuts, they impact everyone. There's no question. I mean, if you have kids, you felt the benefit of those doubling of the child tax credits, for instance, and there's plenty of other provisions here. So I think that Democrats would say it benefits the wealthy at a greater degree than it benefits the middle class, but there's no doubt that it benefits the middle class. The tax cuts are popular. It's just a question of how do you pay for them without blowing up the federal deficit.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks again, Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on Tom Homan's address to Arizona lawmakers, it's Eliana Kernodle.
Tom Homan visited Arizona and spoke to the legislature there this week. Joining me with more is the Center Square's Dave Mason. Dave, what was the focus of Homan's speech and what were some of the highlights?
Yes, hi. So Tom Homan was talking about the progress that's been made by the Trump administration in securing the southern border. He made the point right from the start that more has been done in the last 5 weeks than was done during the 4 weeks of the Biden administration. He pointed out that illegal border crossings are down by 94%, which is, of course, a large number. He pointed out that his priorities include making sure that the illegal border crossings stop, that there are deportations of people who are here illegally, and to find children who are missing. There are 300,000 children who are missing because of the border crossings. Many of these children, sadly, have been thrown into forced labor or are victims of sex trafficking. So he would emphasize the importance of addressing this problem. Now, at the beginning of the speech, the Democrats in the state legislature walked out as a protest against the Trump administration policies. He did address the walkout and said that those people are not aware of the extent of the problem, and he questioned whether they were willing to learn about the extent of the problem.
And one thing he mentioned was the concerns that have been raised about detaining families. What defense did he offer for that?
Yes, that's correct. He's been criticized for his support of detention of the families, but he says it's necessary to detain the families in order to do DNA tests because they don't know whether these children are with their actual parents or whether they're with sex traffickers. So he sees this as a crucial way of protecting the children.
And you were able to speak to Arizona House Speaker Steve Montenegro. He was there. He was sitting behind Tom Homan as he gave his speech. How did Montenegro respond to the speech?
Well, he told me that he loved the speech, that he found it very refreshing to see some action being done on this problem after years of inaction. He said it is terrible what's happening with the children. And he says that if we allow this to continue to happen to the children, to allow them to be missing, to be caught up in this wave of sex trafficking and forced labor, that we as a society are evil if we allow this. He pointed out that the Arizona legislature has been working on ways to help with the immigration problem. In fact, Tom Homan in his speech complimented the Arizona legislature on the bills, including what's called the As ICE Act, which is an Arizona law which requires local and state law enforcement to cooperate with U.S. ICE officials in immigration issues. And he said, actually, that bill, which has passed in the state Senate, could be voted on as early as this week in the House. He also told me that the state lawmakers are looking at ways to increase the punishments for people who are caught doing sex trafficking.
And this bill, if it does pass, I know the state governor is a Democrat. Is she likely to sign this bill? Has this been bipartisan? What's the expectation there?
She has said that she is willing to have cooperation between the different agencies. In fact, she's emphasized the importance of having a joint task force or having agencies work together in attacking things such as drug smuggling. Because a big problem, as the speaker pointed out to me, is the introduction of so much fentanyl that comes across the border. And there has been some concerted efforts between the state and local authorities in trying to crack down on drug smuggling, which is a big reason of why Tom Homan and the Homeland Security Department is so focused on trying to curb the problem of the illegal border crossings. Now, he does not know if she will sign the bill, but he can't fathom why she would not want to sign a bill that would be crucial to the public safety of people in Arizona.
Now, you mentioned the Democrats, they walked out on Tom Homan's speech.
The Democrats were not happy about Tom Homan being there. In fact, Senator Annalise Ortiz, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Election Committee, said, quote, Tom Homan is not welcome in Arizona. The immigrants who have called Arizona home, the families that help the economy, who help take care of the community, they are welcome here. For way too long, Arizona has long been ground zero for harmful policies against immigrant against immigrant communities. So, and then she goes on to say that since Trump has taken office, we have seen hundreds of thousands of individuals deported, people being detained for peaceful protests or having tattoos, and racist rhetoric spewed from both federal and local Republicans. Tom Homan is behind all that. And then other people in the legislature are saying, other Democrats are saying that they feel that the speech on Tuesday was a farce and that the people of Arizona deserve better. One legislator said that she walked out in protest because she refused to hear propaganda about it. And she felt like she has an obligation to speak out at this moment. So the Democrats see this as more of a racial issue. They see this as more of an issue of bigotry against the immigrants, that the immigrants are being treated unfairly. But the Republicans see this as more of a public safety issue. They see this as an issue of trying to crack down on drug smuggling, of trying to keep the children safe from things with sex trafficking and forced labor. And they see this as a way of making sure that people follow on. Now, one interesting thing that the speaker told me is that he immigrated to the U.S. From El Salvador when he was 5 years old. And he's been a naturalized citizen since childhood. And his own personal life experience is that our immigration laws do work if we follow them and if we enforce them.
Well, Dave, thank you for sharing this story with us. You can follow this and other stories at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Dave for that update. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Will we soon see a federal ban on cell phones in schools? What was the outcome of a lawsuit against Chevron in Louisiana? And what does the March jobs report show about the state of the labor market? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. The U.S. Supreme Court on Tuesday ruled that the Trump administration can keep thousands of probationary workers off of the federal payroll as lawsuits challenging the administration's plan to fire them play out in court. In an unsigned two-page decision, the Supreme Court stayed a preliminary injunction placed on the administration's attempt to remove about 16,000 probationary employees from the payroll. Several unions had filed suit arguing the terminations are illegal, but the Supreme Court said that unions don't have standing in the case. The ruling is not final. It effectively means the administration can keep the workers off the payroll as lower courts determine whether the plan to terminate them is legal. President Donald Trump signed 4 executive orders promoting the deregulation and expansion of the coal industry in the United States. White House Staff Secretary Will Sharf said the first order directs all departments and agencies of the federal government to end all discriminatory policies against the coal industry. It ends the leasing moratorium that prevents new coal projects on federal land and will accelerate all permitting and funding for new coal projects. The other executive orders attempt to prevent some Biden-era policies from going into effect that would have caused the shuttering of dozens of American coal plants. Physical storefronts on American military installations owned or controlled by China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea will be banned if a North Carolina congressman's proposal becomes law. U.S. Representative Pat Harrigan also wants to terminate existing contracts with companies untruthful about foreign ownership, require national security review of on-base retailers with foreign ties, and be sure future retail agreements on military bases have transparency and oversight. Citing one example, Harrigan said national supplement retailer GNC is, quote, 100% owned by China's state-run Harbin Pharmaceutical Group, unquote. He said its deals are exempt from federal contracting standards and ownership disclosures. Harrigan said these stores are in a position to collect personal data from our troops, operate with almost no oversight, and answer directly to a hostile foreign government. California legislators are demanding an audit of the taxpayer-funded Medi-Cal program. Legislators say the governor's administration has admitted that half of the state's near doubling of Medi-Cal spending is from providing health care to illegal immigrants, and they're raising questions about its impact on citizens' Medi-Cal care. California Governor Gavin Newsom has requested a $6.2 billion bailout of the program, which recently experienced significant expansions in eligibility and costs of care. On the eligibility side, the state now allows those with qualifying incomes to apply regardless of immigration status. An Ohio lawmaker doesn't want to stop taxpayers from paying for all professional sports stadiums. He only wants to ban it for the losers. As House Republicans continue to push $600 million in taxpayer funds to the Cleveland Browns for a new stadium in Brook Park, Senator Bill DeMora, a Democrat from Columbus, plans legislation that would ban public money from going to professional sports teams unless they've had a winning record in 3 of the previous 5 seasons. That would knock out the Cleveland Browns. New teams would be exempt from the winning requirement, but must be competitive before asking for public money. Teams would also have to report publicly on athletic performance and financial requests. The proposed bill would also require teams to pay back any taxpayer money if they left the city. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
He ran for state office and was beaten. Started a business and failed. Ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug with more on cell phone bans across the country. And on the federal level, it's Eliana Kernodle.
As cell phone bans in schools are gaining steam in dozens of states, one lawmaker is taking it to the federal level by proposing legislation leading to cell phone free schools. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Sarah Roderick Fitch. Sarah, this has been a nationwide conversation with many states considering legislation, and even kind of on a day-to-day level. I think a lot of people talk about the problems in our schools, and this one comes up a lot. But now it could be a national policy conversation. Tell us about this Virginia legislator and the bill that he's proposing.
Yes, it's been being proposed by Congressman. He's a Democratic Congressman, Eugene Vindman, out of Virginia, Northern Virginia. He's a freshman representative, and this is his first term. He's kind of known for the whole initial Trump impeachment. That's sort of, if people recognize his name, that's where he comes from. But yes, it's interesting. So he is proposing this legislation that would essentially direct different state agencies to implement cell phone free education. And he recently, how he kind of came to this conclusion, he recently hosted a roundtable discussion with parents and educators, local leaders, even some students apparently, on the topic, as well as he kind of took some stuff from a psychologist who is as well versed in that sort of in that field, and just sort of taking it from different approaches and seeing how that's, how it's impacting students, how it's impacting maybe teachers' education. He looked at, looking at that from an education aspect. Obviously students are struggling. That's an issue that's across the United States. And then also the other problem is that there's a growing mental health crisis among students. And that's also sort of experts have sort of, tied, both of those into the usage of cell phones in schools. So it's a very interesting ban. I mean, it's kind of been, it's been definitely bubbling up a lot in the country in the last year, really. It's been popping up, and it's really kind of all over now.
Yeah. And you mentioned he talked to a number of different people. Virginia has implemented a ban on this, so they have kind of on the ground experience with this at this point. What has he said about kind of how that's impacted people in Virginia?
Interestingly, so I will say this is definitely a bipartisan issue. This is not a Republican Democrat because, but Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, so was a Republican. He, last year, he put out an executive order, basically lining up saying, hey, he wanted there to be a model policies, directive. He wanted sort of schools, he wanted the Department of Education here in Virginia to come up with, set of policies and guidelines, standards, whatnot for cell phone free education. And it came down to it was a bunch of people. There was a lot of different back and forth, but they essentially came up with this whole like a bell to bell sort of schedule. And so no cell phones during like when school starts to the end, lunch hour, nothing like that. Hey, they have to be put away, whatnot. But apparently, that obviously it seems somewhat successful. Some of the people that Congressman Vindman talked to, he talked to even a student, and the student said, hey, it's working great. I have a nephew who is 16 in high school here. He thinks differently. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I was like, wow, I found one student. But there's a lot of debate on it. But certainly from the level of like mental health professions and educators, they're looking at it going, hey, this is a huge problem. There are parents who kind of want more control over it. They want to be able to contact their kids. And obviously there's been different, policies put in place to ensure that parents can reach their kids, or if there's some sort of medical need or, language thing, whatever, that will be accommodated. But it has, and Vindman, he even said, hey, this has been a success here in Virginia. It's been something that's sort of been replicated. There's 8-9 states that have implemented bans, and I think there's only about a handful. I can't think off the top of my head how many number, but I think about only a handful that don't have anything in the pipeline as of yet to have these bans. So it's definitely something that is spreading across the board. And like I said, it is a completely bipartisan issue, with Republicans and Democrats coming together and really kind of agreeing that this is sort of an issue in the schools. So I think it's really interesting.
It's interesting that so many states have this in the pipeline, are considering it. And yet he's also bringing this like federal legislation. Is it just to get the ball rolling in those states that don't have it yet, or to ensure that something actually does happen in states if maybe they don't pass it?
Yeah, I think maybe a little bit of both. And also, I think it'd be interesting. I mean, it's like I said, it's very, very early, it's very early on. I think too is like trying to come up with, maybe sort of a set policy or whatever. Maybe, some states, they want to have them put in like safe pouches, there's phones. I mean, who knows where this is going to lead to as far as like, resources to be able to provide some of these schools to, lock away to lock away the phones. It could also lead to, maybe at some point, I don't know, being able to, I don't know, I'm not a technology person, but, like a jammer or something like that in the schools. We don't know, where this will lead to ensure that these schools maybe don't have this, the students don't have the capability, or who knows, with, maybe an agreement with, cell phone providers. I don't know where this will lead to and how that's going to, develop, but I think it's a very interesting sort of thing. But yeah, there's been some states that have Like Ohio, for instance, just recently, they're now introducing it. Ohio saying, hey, they had been leaving it up to the school districts, and now they want to have the governor there, DeWine, he wants to have more control over it, saying, hey, no, you need to have a policy. So I think kind of in the same, this is sort of the same sort of sense as maybe just to sort of ensure, that some of these states that don't have it, or maybe they're a little bit more, they're a little bit looser on the, on their policies and whatnot, is just kind of have like, I think really probably a national sort of, a model of like, hey, this is how we want this to work. And it's interesting. Yeah. I think he kind of wants to model it after Virginia, where, so it is really interesting that like New York is kind of trying to do the same thing. California has done the same thing. Arkansas. I mean, you can, it's fascinating to see how quickly this is sort of caught on. It's caught on like fire. It's just, it's going everywhere. It's spreading. It'll be interesting to see where this leads to. I think it's definitely going to become more of a debate.
Well, it's very interesting. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. You can continue to follow this at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Sarah. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Crew. With more on a lawsuit in Louisiana against Chevron, it's Steve Wilson.
With me is Louisiana statewide reporter Nolan McKendry. And Nolan has been writing about a huge story that has nationwide implications, and that is a massive $744 million verdict in a coastal erosion lawsuit against oil and gas companies. Nolan, how big is this decision and what are the implications?
Well, it's a very big decision. The final decision perhaps could come by the Supreme Court if they decide to weigh in. The implications are potentially a great deal of a loss of business for the oil and gas industries. There are currently 40-some lawsuits awaiting the different courts in Louisiana. And if worst case scenario is if each lawsuit is won, then that can mean a great deal of money lost for these industries. And so accordingly, they have to respond by potentially raising their prices or doing less business. On the other hand, of course, we should be interested in holding oil and gas industries accountable. And this might set a precedent that could at least help achieve that. It might require oil and gas companies to take a little bit more time, to be a little bit more responsible.
Well, I guess, my question is, what are the legal arguments for the oil and gas companies having to pay this huge amount and other possible huge awards in these type of lawsuits? And the other thing is, what are the oil and gas companies saying that they don't bear responsibility or culpability for this?
That's right. So the damage in this proof of proof case that was done, happened decades ago. I believe in 1941, and it was done in agreement with the federal government, as a means for World War II and helping the war cause. And it was also done by a company that was acquired by the company that's now being sued, which is, I believe, Texaco, which was acquired by Chevron in 2001. And so the argument is that the law that was established after those, the damage being done cannot retroactively apply now. On the other hand, the courts are, of course, arguing that it doesn't really matter that, the law was passed, and Chevron doesn't deny that indeed coastal erosion did happen, and, environmental damage occurred. And they attribute it to worsening climate change.
Well, I know, the oil and gas companies provide a lot of property tax revenue in Louisiana, not to mention all of the people in Louisiana that are employed by the oil and gas industry. You've got Port Fourchon, which is, of course, nothing but oil and gas support for offshore oil drilling. You've got all the helicopter fields that support those oil drilling platforms. What would be the effect if if this thing goes all the way up to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court finds that the oil and gas companies have culpability in this matter?
Well, they argue, I assume that the oil and gas industry would say that it would, kind of put a very big target on their back. One of the things that Louisiana is really struggling with is, what you might call lawsuit abuse, which is, attempting, sort of frivolous lawsuits and attempting to secure very large payouts for them, perhaps exceeding what is actually needed. And so oil and gas industries will perhaps be almost paranoid, and it just will refuse to do business in areas where they're scared of getting sued.
Guess my last question is this going to be one of those, could this be, in your opinion, could this be one of these precedent setting decisions that when it goes up to the Supreme Court, this is something that could echo through the legal landscape of the United States, not just in the Pelican State, but the whole country for many years to come?
Yes, certainly. And not just for the oil and gas industry, for any sort of environmental damage caused by any company in any industry. That from what I understand, there are also cases of the sort that Chevron was sued for in, I believe, Pennsylvania and California. And if the Supreme Court accepts the, rules against Chevron, again, accepting the $744 million lawsuit, it can mean a lot more lawsuits in a lot more places and against a lot more industries, that hold companies responsible for damage that was done prior to laws being created.
Well, thank you, Nolan, for joining us, and thank you for giving us some great insights on coastal erosion and Louisiana's oil and gas industry in these lawsuits.
Thank you, Stephen Nolan. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss the jobs report, it's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, the jobs report came in, and I mean, objectively, it was sizzling hot. I think all in, the jobs report came in at 228,000 for the month of March. Somewhat surprising, but I don't know. Maybe not to you.
So let's put it this way. Surprising. The headline number was surprising, right?
The size of it. I mean, the fact that it beat the estimate by the amount that it did.
That's right. But I would not call it sizzling hot.
Oh, okay.
I would not call it sizzling hot.
Well, I did. So you're just saying that you wouldn't call it sizzling hot?
I would not. You did. And I would not call it sizzling hot. And the reason I would not call it sizzling hot is, well, first of all, employment numbers for January were revised down. February numbers were revised down as well. And that means the 3-month average, right, was lower than it was a month ago. It was down to 152. If you take out 152 compared to 184 for total non-farm, and then for total private, it was down to 135 from 161. I did a talk yesterday where I told people, look, it's good to take all of the data together, and that you cannot possibly look at just one data point from one data source and make any kind of conclusions about anything. When you're trying to understand the economy and where it's headed. And this applies today, right? The labor market is still cooling. It's not crashing, but it's cooling. Mm-hmm. The 228 number is comfort that it's not crashing. Mm-hmm. It does not mean it's accelerating or sizzling hot. The labor market, you had a small increase in labor force participation, which was good. So you have more, the hiring rate hasn't really moved very much. Still very low, at a 10-year low. The layoff rate still pretty flat, right? Low, thank God, right? The unemployment rate slightly higher at 4.2%. Part of that is the increase in the labor force. Mm-hmm. But things are not necessarily improving. This might have been the last hurrah in the labor market, because remember, this jobs report came before the massive drop in stock prices, mm-hmm. we talked about on the show, but also in the Center Square column, the concept, the fact that when financial wealth drops, people spend less due to what we call a negative wealth effect. Okay. The economy is slowing. The tariff shock is going to have an impact. It's already having an impact. And of course, you're going to see it in the months ahead.
Yeah.
And so I think people should know that and should be prepared for that. I think people kind of know it instinctively already know. Consumer confidence are not as low. The business confidence is very low. And so, this was a good report. It was reassuring.
Mm-hmm.
It was reassuring, but it still hasn't been able to stop the bleeding.
So inside of that report, I mean, I think it's worthwhile, talking about what role government jobs played in that. You and I have talked over the past couple of years about the jobs report being influenced, and I'm the one who beats the drum on this. You're not you, but I mean, we had some job growth during the previous administration that was perhaps influenced by a lot of government spending and a lot of government job creation. This job report, despite the fact that it came in at 228, which again, that's a number for now. It probably will be revised. But that actually showed a decline of 4,000, jobs in March, after 11,000 federal jobs in February. So, I mean, in terms of like the number of jobs that are actually being taken out of the federal government and the way that's being reported, you would think that there's like this mass hemorrhaging. Like, I believe it was like the Clinton administration, and like 400,000 federal workers were let go in the Clinton tenure. This is, this would be, a 2-month decline of only 15,000 jobs so far. What factor is that in any of the considerations, around, employment at this point?
Well, look, you got 3 million government employees, federal government employees. You got 23.6 million total government employees between state, local, and federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And so far we've seen 15,000. Again, I don't want to dismiss this because I don't think it should be dismissed. And the reason I don't think it should be dismissed is that ultimately government employment is people, it's families, it's, and those people take those dollars and they spend them into the economy. And those dollars are not spent in a vacuum. They get spent on goods and services that private sector business owners also benefit from. And so we have to make the point that, the economy is this big circle. When it's spent, it's got to be produced somewhere, and it's employing private sector workers too, because it's spent at a private sector business somewhere. So I think
that's a factor in the economy.
Exactly. Sure. I think it's important to say that, and that if you cut government jobs, you're essentially shrinking aggregate demand.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.